Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another ZFA Conversation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching us. Now, tonight we have a special treat for you. Tal Shalev is the chief political correspondent for Walla News, one of Israel's largest news websites. Tal covers and analyzes news about all things political in Israel, which, given the variety of parties in Israel's parliament and the breathtaking pace, not just of Israel's political developments, but the near constant election cycles over the past few years, I reckon that's a position that only the brave of heart would put their hands up for. Tal has been a journalist for a decade and a half with stints in TV, traditional print media, and now the fast-paced world of online news. She's a regular guest on TV and radio, and we are absolutely thrilled that she can provide us with a few clues about what's happening in Israel, politics-wise, at the moment. So, Tal, welcome.
Hi, Bren. Happy to be here.
And we're happy to see you. But let me just start with your dad used to live in Australia. Is that right? When was that?
I think it was 2002 to 2007. My dad's wife, aka my stepmother, Tal Shalev, was the trade attaché, Israel's trade attaché in Sydney. And he and my two little sisters lived in Vaucluse for 5 years, and I had the honor and privilege and fun to come and visit them a few times. And we have a warm, my sisters went to Moriah, so like we have a warm spot in our hearts for Australia and for Sydney and down
right
under.
Well, look, you know, Sydney's all right. I mean, sure. I mean, I happen to live in Melbourne, but no, that sounds wonderful. And you know, as we were saying just before we started, the Australian election, Australia's political system and our election cycles, they're not only less frequent than Israel, but they're a little bit more calmer. So let's delve straight in and start talking about the Israeli election season that's once again upon us. I think the first question is this one. How much is this election going to be about the cost of living and other, if you like, normal political issues, or how much is it just going to be once again about Bibi in a popularity contest of him?
So at the end of the day, the answer is yes, it's going to be all about Bibi, because that is the main dividing question in Israeli politics in the past few years, and that hasn't changed. We call it the political plonter, which is basically the political mess, and all of this mess is the origin of it is the fact that Netanyahu is the most popular leader in Israel, the most popular politician in Israel, but he's delegitimized or not legitimate by over 50% of the voters. And the whole race from Israel from one election to another is always about Netanyahu's attempt to reach 61, to have a majority of parliament members. And that again is the story this time. Now, there are different, the setting is different, right? It's not the same setting as our previous election. So you're right, the cost of living is a very hot issue in Israel today. Israel's in a very expensive place to begin with. And now with global economic crisis, there's a horrendous price rise in almost every spectrum. In almost everything is just extremely expensive. And Netanyahu is trying to turn this into the question of the election, and he's trying to use this as the government's hot spot, soft spot, the one where he can attack them on and try to blame the government. Problem with it is that it's not strong enough to dissolve the yes or no Bibi division. Whoever supports Netanyahu will buy his propaganda and will probably blame the government for the economic crisis. And whoever is against Netanyahu will understand that an economic crisis and the price of living is not a product of 1 year. It's a product of many years in which Netanyahu was leading the economic policy, the economic policy. So it's going to be, yes, about Netanyahu with small other issues. Another issue that will come up is going to be the issue of the cooperation with Arab parties in the Knesset. The outgoing government had a unique cooperation and agreement with Ra'am, one of the Arab parties, and the current Prime Minister Yair Lapid also hasn't ruled out building a coalition with the other Arab party in the Knesset, the Joint List. Netanyahu and the right-wing parties are going to try and make this into an election issue and try and present the center-left as the center-left parties as people who want to, hurt Israel's Jewish character and hurt Israel's security. Even though one should say the partnership between Ram and the coalition in the past year did not hurt Israel's security whatsoever. It had no security aspect. By the way, Israel is actually finishing one of its quietest years security-wise in the past decade.
I definitely want to have a good conversation about the Arab vote and about the Arab party's involvement and potential involvement in the coalition. But first, we stick with Bibi. Last time there was an election, obviously Bibi was still in power. Now he's obviously not. He doesn't have, if you like, his hands on the levers of power. He can't use government decisions, if you like, as an election campaign. And obviously that power now rests with the current government and Lapid. And the other matter is that Bibi now has an ongoing trial, which I can't remember if that had officially started at the last election, But so how much of the fact that Bibi is not in power and that his trial is ongoing will affect the election, do you think?
So, first of all, I don't know. It's the first time that in the last election campaign, and basically the first time in the last 13 years, that Netanyahu is not the prime minister during the election. So it'll be very interesting to see how that affects his campaign. It's more important to Yair Lapid as prime minister to see how he will use the power and control and influence you get when you're prime minister, how he will use it for his campaign. But the fact that Netanyahu is not in power actually might work for him, because in the past election campaigns, Likud voters saw him sitting in his seat and they didn't really have a motivation to go out and vote. Now they're after a year in the opposition, a year in which they haven't been in power, and at least some of the Likud people are hoping and counting on it that this will bring out their rise their electoral turnout, that their voters will just turn out much more because because Netanyahu is not in power anymore. Now about the trial, I think it's already, it doesn't have any influence anymore because it's already incarnated in the division. There's no one in Israel, almost no one in Israel, who doesn't have an opinion about Netanyahu at this point. So the trial, sometimes you have a more scandalous testimony, a less scandalous testimony, but it doesn't really influence the core beliefs of people, which are already very much designed. Where can it change? It can change on the margins. So, right, Netanyahu needs to, if he wants to reach 61, if he wants to win this time, then he needs to bring back some voters that voted for the Lapid-Bennett coalition in the last election. It's about 70, there's not much there. It's 80,000, 100,000 people who voted for the right-wing parties in the coalition and were disappointed with it or do not support Lapid as prime minister, and Netanyahu will try to bring them back to the Likud.
Well, I was going to say, with Bennett's departure, it feels like his party is sort of disintegrating. I mean, do you think there's going to be a whole bunch of voters going back to Likud from that party?
So that's a tricky question because Yamina voters today, Bennett's voters today, are not the people who voted for Bennett last year. The people who voted for Bennett last year already left him, most of them, when he joined and formed this government.
Understood.
And then and then in the past year, he succeeded to build himself back by new voters from the soft right or the center, people who supported the government and thought he was a not bad prime minister. So Bennett's supporters today, half of them are basically from the Just Not Bibi bloc, and the other half might go back. But also, we don't know if Ayelet Shaked, Bennett's comrade and partner, she's now heading Yamina. She's trying to form another party, a new party, or not a new party, continue to lead Yamina and try to make kind of connections and survive after Bennett left. She could take votes from both sides, and then she could be, the kingmaker of Netanyahu or the other side in the next election.
And what's her relationship with Bibi?
It's complicated. It's for over the years, it's been horrible. Over the years, like in the past 15 years or so, it's been horrible. Netanyahu's wife hates Ayelet Shaked. And she's a very influential politician. She's basically one of the people making the decisions. In the past year, when Netanyahu thought he could use Shaked for bringing down the government, and there was some kind of warming up between them. But politically now, Netanyahu is basically testing Shaked to see exactly if she takes votes from him or she takes votes from the other side.
Understood.
And only then will he decide how he's going to treat her in the election. But if Netanyahu decides to treat Ayelet Shaked as a traitor during the election, she might find it very, very difficult to survive.
Understood. I might add, I would encourage people watching this, if they want to ask questions, click on the Q&A box down the bottom of your screen, type in your question. Yael, I can see that your hand is up. I'm going to ask you to write your question down. And Ben, I can see your question there. I've got a very similar question on my notepad. I want to ask that myself. So I'll hold off from asking that and ask it very soon. Tal, another difference between this election and the last one is that Donald Trump is no longer in power in the White House. Do you think that will make a difference? Because Bibi was best friends with Trump and, seemed to indicate or imply that he had all this, this inside advantage by the two of them being there.
So, of course, we don't have Trump, we have Biden, and he's arriving this week, and he's going to be in Israel for a three-day visit. It's his first visit since he entered the job, and well, basically, he's going to Trump, just like Trump trumped Bibi. Biden is going to like, this is basically a big election present or big campaign present for Yair Lapid. Lapid is going to be the first prime minister in 12 years, in 13 years, who's welcoming an American president who isn't Netanyahu. In the last two presidential visits we had, both Obama and Trump, Netanyahu was the one who hosted the visit. And this time it's Lapid, and he's going to be on the red carpet. And they're hoping in Yesh Atid that this will give them, a boost in their campaign and kind of turn it into a head-to-head fight between him and Netanyahu.
But my memory sadly goes back ever longer. And I remember Clinton tried to help Perez in the election back in the 90s against Bibi, from memory, and that backfired. And I don't think it would be wrong to say that Trump tried to help Bibi, and that didn't really work either. So is Biden, I guess Lapid wants to look presidential, but I guess at the same time, he's probably sending frantic, WhatsApp messages to the White House saying, don't come on too strongly because you just might hurt my chances.
Well, Lapid has a tradition. Traditionally, American presidents like to meddle with Israeli politics. Trump did not make up anything, not invent anything, but he and Netanyahu definitely, made it into an art. Listen, Biden's visit to the Middle East isn't really about Israel, right? It's about Saudi Arabia, and Israel is just the nice trip on the way. Also for Biden's own electoral reasons, right? So I think that both sides will really want to stress their very, very good relationship. I don't think it can hurt Lapid, of course, unless there's some collateral mistake or something that he does that's very embarrassing, which could happen because we're in Israel. But basically, we're very far away from the election. The election is only on the 1st of November. So even if Lapid gets some kind of boost now from Biden's visit, it's not going to last until the election. It's important for the staging of the campaign and positioning, but not necessarily for the long term has influence on the election results.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I do want to turn away from Bibi, but before I do so, Howard Schrute has asked a question that I want to ask you. He's asked, is there any chance of an internal Likud leadership challenger, obviously in the next little while, that has a realistic chance of replacing Bibi before the election?
No, the answer is no. Netanyahu is constantly has about 70% of the Likud vote. He's only become stronger over the past few years, and whoever tried to challenge him always it didn't do good to anyone. So the last time there was a challenge for the Likud leadership was in December 2019. It was Gideon Eizenkot. He got 28% of the vote, and then afterwards, a year later, left the Likud and founded his own party. Yuli Edelstein, the former Knesset speaker, was contemplating running against Netanyahu, and he even announced he would do so last year. But that was when he thought Netanyahu was getting weaker after losing power. But what we saw in the past year is that Netanyahu did not get weaker. Did not get any weaker. He only got stronger. So even Yuli Edelstein withdrew his candidacy because he didn't want to take a chance that he would be punished by the Likud voters later in the primary for the list.
But I mean, surely if Bibi fails to form a coalition after this election, is he done, or will he continue? Just we had a former prime minister say that other former prime ministers were miserable ghosts, and he didn't want to be a miserable ghost and sort of hang around the halls of power. Will Bibi remain a miserable ghost if he loses the next election?
The only thing I can say is that I am never going to, to declare Netanyahu's end before I see it. I mean, time and again, people say, yeah, after the next election, the Likud will kick him out. The Haredi politicians will leave their alliance with him. That didn't happen. Now, I will say that this time, the ultra-Orthodox parties, the Haredim, at least the Ashkenazi Haredim, are playing a different tune. And you have Moshe Gafni, the leader of the Ashkenazi party, Yadut Torah. He's kind of hinting that if Netanyahu doesn't have 61 the next time, it doesn't reach the majority, then it's time to rethink our game. But that's also, it's just political flirting. Most of the ultra-Orthodox voters support Netanyahu.
Yeah.
That's why the ultra-Orthodox parties are in such a strong alliance with Netanyahu, because if they're not, they won't be in such a strong alliance, their voters might vote for Netanyahu and not for them.
Understood.
So I think it's too early to declare. But I will say that, Netanyahu is already, I don't know, I think it's 2 years into the trial. There's another few years going. Another few years expecting ahead. Last December, he negotiated a plea deal. He was on a way to the plea deal. So I don't know if he loses the next time. If he can't reach a majority, then maybe a plea deal will be back on the table.
Lapid's father obviously made a career of being anti-religious, but my understanding that Yair Lapid is he obviously leads a self-declared secular party, but he's not anti-religious. That's my understanding. Is that Is that your understanding? You look a bit doubtful.
Lapid is perceived as very anti-religious. His first campaign, just building him, like bringing him into politics, was one that was based on the question, where is the money? And the answer was the money is at the ultra-Orthodox, with the ultra-Orthodox communities. Also, he is perceived by the ultra-Orthodox politicians as a finance minister who, and as his secular agenda also threatens them, and his alliance with Avigdor Lieberman, another enemy of the Haredi politicians, make him, I wouldn't say he's not a persona non grata as much as Lieberman is, but he definitely is not, he's I wouldn't say he's friendlier to the Haredim than his parents. He's trying to change that in the past year or so. He's cultivating a strong, he's building a strong relationship with Daphne from Yadut Torah, who I mentioned earlier. He's trying to change that, but it still hasn't really yielded any results.
So what is Lapid's campaign then? What's he focusing on, apart from not being Bibi?
Well, he's going to focus on being prime minister. He's going to focus on international affairs. That's where he thinks his forte is. He's going to have the Biden visit here, and after Biden, Biden continues to Saudi Arabia. So we're predicting some kind of announcement on some kind of normalization steps between Israel and Saudi Arabia. You can see that Lapid spoke this weekend with Mahmoud Abbas, with Abu Mazen for the first discussion, first telephone talk between a prime minister and the PA president since 2017.
Wow.
So Lapid's main agenda is going to be diplomatic, and also he's going to talk about, he's going to try and be very uniting and try to be very mellow. Yes, try to be not Netanyahu. Netanyahu is going to go to a divisive campaign, so Lapid will go to an inclusive campaign. But we should mention that there's another candidate who wants to be prime minister and wants to be part of this race, and that's Benny Gantz. And Benny Gantz's goal is to try and turn this race between Netanyahu and Lapid to a three-headed race, and to have a chance at becoming the prime minister. If Netanyahu or Lapid don't have 61, Benny Gantz wants to be the one who will have the highest chances of forming.
Because I saw an article on Thursday or Friday this week that said that Gantz was always a bit grumpy that that Bennett's party got less seats than his party did, and yet he was never looked at as a possible prime minister.
Well, Gantz has been grumpy. He has been grumpy, and he has a good reason for being grumpy. So if we go back to the story, right? He, in 2020, in the midst of the COVID virus, he joins a government with Netanyahu, and he was supposed to become prime minister in a few months time, right? So from Gantz's point of view, seeing Bennett enter the prime minister's office, and then Lapid, his former partner, entering the prime minister's office before him, it's difficult. But it should be mentioned that Gantz had the opportunity just a few weeks ago, before the Knesset was dissolved. The ultra-Orthodox parties, did offer, the ultra-Orthodox parties offered him, come be a prime minister. Let's prevent elections. Let's form an alternative government with Netanyahu in this Knesset. You'll be the prime minister. But Gantz declined. He didn't want to take a chance. He didn't believe Netanyahu. He didn't believe Netanyahu wouldn't cheat him again. So Gantz feels like he actually let Lapid become prime minister by giving that offer up, but he does plan after the election to take the job away.
So how does he differentiate from Lapid? I mean, what are the differences between the two men or the two parties?
Well, there's not a real difference between the two parties. Perhaps, but there is a personality difference between Gantz and Lapid. Their background, of course. One is a former TV star, and the other is a former IDF chief of staff. They have a different style. Lapid is much better with words than Gantz is. But what Gantz is going to do is most likely that he's going to join forces with Gideon Eizenkot and merge with a right-wing party, New Hope, which was one of the right-wing parties in this coalition. And by merging together, he's taking a bit more right-wing stance than he had, and definitely compared to Lapid. But by merging together, that's supposed to create some kind of growth that will enable Gantz, give Gantz the legitimacy to become prime minister. He understands he does not want to be another Naftali Bennett. He does not want to be from a small party and then have questions about his legitimacy. He wants to be from a medium party and then be able to demand.
Understood. I want to turn to Ben Pask's question. He asks, will Lapid actually be able to accomplish much in the next few months? Either symbolically, obviously, he called Abu Mazen, as you've already mentioned, or practically. And that actually, it's very similar to another question I had jotted down, which is, will he, apart from any national security issues which might pop up unexpectedly, will Lapid actually make any bold decisions over the next few months? Or do you think he's going to be, careful on the way to the election?
So Lapid is leading an interim government. He's only in a caretaker job. There's not much this government can do internally. It can't really allocate budgets. It can't really make any far-reaching decisions. It can't even make significant appointments because we're in election time. So that's why his main focus will be diplomatically and security. And his main goal is to have zero crises and zero mistakes. So I don't see him doing anything dramatic because that would risk the policy of zero crises and zero mistakes. But as I said, it's a very long election campaign. It's 4 months. Yeah. A lot can happen. We're in the Middle East, and security things can happen, God forbid. But I think that's the unexpected is Lapid's biggest enemy in the prime minister's office during the campaign.
Which party will Gideon Eizenkot join? What's your inside knowledge?
So basically, there are two parties who are scouting Gideon Eizenkot. One is Lapid, and the other one is Gantz. Lapid has, after his experience with Gantz and with Bogi Ya'alon, Lapid decided that he will no longer merge his list with any other body, meaning he's offering Gideon Eizenkot a place on the list, but only for himself. And Gideon Eizenkot wants to come with a group of politicians behind him. He wants to come with a group of 3, 4 people to have some kind of power inside the Knesset. This is supposedly one of the lessons he learned from Gabi Ashkenazi's experience a few years ago. Ashkenazi didn't have any political power inside Blue and White, which made him kind of helpless against Gantz, and he couldn't really influence decisions inside the party. So Gideon Eizenkot, if he comes, by the way, I'm not sure. It's not a done deal that Gideon Eizenkot has decided to enter politics. He's looking at the map. He's looking to see how it works. But Gantz's plan is to bring Gideon Eizenkot, as I mentioned earlier, from the right, and then bring Gideon Eizenkot from the left, and then have a real serious, echelon to present against Lapid and Netanyahu.
It's interesting that you sort of that you mentioned Gantz's idea of creating this serious centrist party, but and Lapid, I have to say, is a bit of an exception here. But Israeli politics have constantly thrown up these centrist parties over the last 2 decades, which are always going to be the next big thing. And then after one or two elections, they sort of fizzled away. And to a certain extent, Yesh Atid has proven the difference. And maybe that's because Labour has fizzled away to almost nothing. And so, you know, nature abhors a vacuum. But, you know, if Saar does this, I can't help, sorry, if Gantz does this, I can't help but feel it'll just dissolve, it'll just disintegrate over two election cycles. And then everyone will sort of, you know, drizzle away to their political homeland, so to speak.
So, first of all, it's just that the agenda, I would say the dividing line, because of the yes or not Bibi issue, then the dividing line of Israeli politics is no longer anything substantial. I mean, well, I wouldn't, I want to rephrase that. It's not the traditional substantial things, like the traditional divide between left and right, which divided and gave importance to Meretz or to other right-wing parties about the Palestinian issue. It's just not on the table. And the traditional, and the divide is now, the essence is about Netanyahu, but it's not about Netanyahu per se. It's about a prime minister who's been indicted with three files of bribery and breach of trust. It's not only Netanyahu, it's about the tone and style that Netanyahu's supporters have and their plans to reform the judicial system. It's about their tone and style towards Arabs. So what's actually happening here over the elections campaign is that one camp, Netanyahu's camp, is much more religious with his alliance with the ultra-Orthodox and the radical right, Tal Shalev and Itamar Ben-Gvir. So he has a conservative religious alliance, but the other bloc is basically the liberal, I wouldn't say progressive because there are different sides there, but the liberal, moderate, more consensual bloc. And they can't find themselves, the only person who can bring this bloc together, these two blocs together, actually might be Benny Gantz. Because of what we said about the ultra-Orthodox and the way they see Lapid, the ultra-Orthodox parties love Gantz. Not only do they love Gantz, they feel guilty that that Bibi cheated him, and that because of they feel
guilty because Lapid is now prime minister, or because they actually feel guilty?
No, they feel guilty not because Lapid is prime minister. They feel guilty because they understand that it led them to lose, to lose the government eventually, to the Bennett-Lapid government, which was established without Haredi parties for the first time since 2015. Now the other parties are, so then you have the small, satellite parties, Meretz and the Labor Party, as you mentioned. They're both in big danger in this election. They were both in big danger in the previous elections as well, but I think in this election even more, because with Lapid in the premiership, the center-left voters actually see a situation. They actually see an alternative. So if you're a center-left voter and you don't want Netanyahu to come back, Lapid becomes your immediate emotional candidate. Merav Michaeli, the leader of the Labor Party, in the last election, she had like this kind of newcomer success, and she kind of raised the party from the ashes under the electoral threshold, and she kind of raised it. She doesn't have that newcomer sense anymore. And she's also, after a year in government, she's a transportation minister. Israel has huge transportation crises. And these are things that Israelis are going to feel all summer, because we have a crisis in the airport and we have traffic jams crises, and all of this is, I think, is very bad for her. It's a very bad portfolio for her to have during the campaign.
Understood. It's interesting. You sort of said the party, that the political system has moved a little bit from, if you like, the traditional ideas of where Labour and Meretz traditionally were at. But and I do want to move, I don't want to talk about Palestinians soon, but if you like, that sort of idea of Labour and Meretz being traditionally, wanting to push peace, and Likud and the right-wing parties wanting to hold that back, if you like, or have at least different concepts of what peace looks like. But I mean, arguably that really only started happening in the late 80s or early 90s. Now, I know that was suddenly 20, 30 years ago, but I remember talking to a journalist in Israel in 2002, and the Intifada was, had kicked off. It was at its very worst. The second Intifada was at its very worst then. And he said Labor will never get back in power in Israel until it stops focusing on the peace process and starts focusing on traditional Labor socioeconomic values. And it feels like that it's not exactly the same, but it feels like the current map of Israeli political system is a little bit less focused on the peace process and much more focused on, if you like, traditional, well, reflective of where the right is outside of Israel and reflective of where the left is outside of Israel. It feels like Israeli politics is sort of becoming a bit normalized.
So I think the Israeli public, first of all, this is important to note, the Israeli public is much more right-wing than it was in 2002 today.
True.
Yeah, in a sharp contrast to what's happening in other places in the world, Israeli youngsters are more right-wing. They're not progressive. They're much more right-wing. This has to do with years of terror and years of lack of dialogue, and the fact that the Palestinian and that Netanyahu and Abbas, from his part, successfully brought the situation to a deadlock and to an issue that's not on the table. And most Israelis do not see the so-called occupation in their eyes at all. They only feel it in times of terror. Luckily, we haven't had such a, we did have in April a very horrible month of terror, peak of terror. There were, I think, 19 people killed in 1 month in Israel by Palestinian terrorists. But it's just, it's kind of the idealists. There are not very many idealists left to talk about it, because anyone else who's a pragmatist has to go to other places. That being said, the Labor's biggest, I think, if I can connect, the Labor did not succeed, even when it had socialist leaders like Sheli Yachimovich 10 years ago, who really promoted a socialist agenda. They did not succeed to connect to the weak layers of Israeli society. The Labor Party is still considered very elitist, and the fact that there is no real economic discussion in Israel, that's where the Labor Party over the years also lost its socialist agenda and had, like, Tzipi Livni, who's not a socialist, was part of the Labor Party, not part of the Labor, but part of the Zionist camp. So I think the Labor Party is definitely in an identity crisis, but also it failed to create new audiences and to find new audiences and to turn around the traditional divide where Netanyahu, who's the most capitalist of them all, he enjoys the support of the weakest parts of Israeli society.
And will Labor ever be able to turn that round, or are they is this just a long-term decline that will end in eventually going under the threshold?
So Merav Michaeli started out with a promise of bringing back the Labor to be, a real power party. But when we look at what happened over the past year, that didn't happen. Labor is in a weaker spot. It's not, it's Lapid, Merav Michaeli is like fighting now against one giant, Lapid, because Lapid is already a giant. His party is not a democratic party, so it's much easier to run it, but he's still a giant, and she's also going to be front-facing Gantz. And Michaeli's biggest danger, in my opinion, is the fact that there are two big players who are going to be in the race for the center-left leadership, Gantz and Lapid, and Michaeli won't be able to enter that race. She's just not in that place, and then they can shove her up from both sides. I think that Michaeli is probably, the Labor Party is even in bigger danger than Meretz, because Meretz voters at least their strong agenda on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, on the occupation, on the two-state solution, they're the only ones who are still voicing that agenda. So at least the Meretz party voters have a much more ideological connection to their party than the Labor Party voters, who some of them came last time for Michaeli because she was new, and the other ones came because she was a woman. She won't have all of that working for her this time.
Well, speaking of the threshold, I mean, we've been focusing on the parties that are going to get lots of votes. But in a way, I imagine the election is actually going to be determined by those parties that don't make the threshold, because that sort of, allows the other parties. I mean, I guess we should be focusing on all those parties that are only going to get 4 seats, or potentially 3 seats, and therefore, because I think 4 is the minimum, right? Is that the threshold? And then, so in a way, I mean, yeah, so
3.25% of the vote is a threshold, and that is usually 4 seats.
Right, exactly. So those parties that don't make that threshold, in a way, they'll disappear, and suddenly other parties, that they will allow other parties to get in. So I really, on the Bibi side of things, including the religious parties, are there parties there that will potentially go under the threshold and therefore, relatively speaking, allow the other side, or is it all the sort of, if you like, the Lapid side of politics where they're all at danger of going under threshold?
No, first of all, when we look at the map now, and the map in the polls is still very preliminary because we don't know exactly who's going to be running with each other. But on Bibi's side, you have the Likud, you have the ultra-Orthodox parties who always get the same number of mandates from each election to each election. And you have Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who are basically two parties who are supposed to be running together.
I find it very concerning that they appear to have shot up in their support in Israel, that Israeli society appear to be supporting these extremists a lot more than they deserve.
Well, first of all, I think that's happening all around the world. If I look at the last election results in France, I think I can see that. If I look at what's happening in the United States, I think I can see that.
I hear that.
As I said, Israel has been growing in the past 25 years, 30 years, gradually moving to the right, meaning that the margins and the sides of this is also growing right, and that social media and the legitimization that Itamar Ben-Gvir got from Netanyahu because of his own personal political needs, that of course has strengthened. But Itamar Ben-Gvir is just I should say, he's a very good, even though he has horrendous opinions, he's a very good politician, and he's a very good propaganda person. And he's and yes, I find that if they don't, by the way, so if they don't run together, if they fight, there's always politics with the settlers. If something happens and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich don't run together, then both of them could be hypothetically on their way, could be in the danger of not passing the electoral threshold. Then you have another politician named Amichai Shikli. Amichai Shikli was a member of Bennett's party in the last election, but he was the first defector. Even before the government was established, he announced he's not joining the government.
Yeah.
It's not clear how he's going to run. He's popular, and might have to run by himself because Bennett punished him in some kind of parliamentary procedure. So the punishment is that he will have to run by himself. Okay. It's not clear if there's enough electorate for him to run by himself and pass the threshold. And Ayelet Shaked, who we don't know who she'll be running with, and currently doesn't pass the threshold, but we also don't know whose vote does she bring down the drain. Still, this is very, very, the deadline for closing the list is in 2 months' time. So all of this puzzle building will be very different in 2 months' time.
Right. Understood. So I want to talk, suddenly we've only got 15 minutes left, and we haven't talked about Mansour Abbas and his party and the joint list. We were talking before our conversation officially started about the wave of pragmatism that has gone through the Middle East, which has resulted in things like the Abraham Accords, but many other issues in the Middle East. And in a way, it feels like that Abbas joining the coalition government, not out of any ideological flag-waving Zionist agenda, but merely to improve the living standards of his people, is pragmatism. It's a pragmatic choice. So the question, and obviously the joint list has been much more nationalistic, much more ideological. They haven't joined any government because they've almost as a protest. Not that previous governments have necessarily wanted them to join, but at the same time, they've been much more focused on the Palestinian nationalist cause. So this will be fascinating, I think, between the Arab vote. First of all, how many of Israeli Arabs will vote in this election compared to the last election? But secondly, I wonder, in your opinion, will they reward the nationalist ideologues of the joint list, or will they reward the pragmatists of Ra'am?
So that's the big question of the election, right? I think the Arab voters in Israel are facing a very dramatic test to where they want their partnership or their citizenship with the state of Israel to go, because everything that happened in Israel in the past few years in the political system is very, very sick and ill and negative. The only good thing that happened is that the Arab politicians have become part of the game. And Mansour Abbas brings this in the past year to a peak of civilian cooperation between Arab MKs and a government, and he's part of decision making, and he's part of allocating budgets, and he's a significant part of the game. But not only Mansour Abbas is a significant part of the game, because also Ahmed Tibi and Ayman Odeh from the joint list, they cooperate the whole last year with Bibi Netanyahu. The only way that Bibi Netanyahu could poise defeats on the coalition in the Knesset was when he cooperated with Ahmed Tibi. So basically, you saw for the most active Arab party ever in the coalition, but also the most active party ever in the opposition. And you have, in my opinion, I've never seen, I mean, it's a process that I've been seeing from during the elections, but this really, I've never seen the Arab politicians be such a part of Israeli politics, playing the game, and not just being representatives of the Palestinian people, but just playing the game, by the way, as representatives of their own constituents. And I really think that this is going to be the test of the Arab voters, to see if they have a traditional low turnout. In the last election, they had 44% turnout in the Arab sector. If it stays that low, I think that sends a message about where the Arab citizens want their citizenship to be. I think that I think it'll be very disappointing. I think that the number one civilian duty and civilian right is to vote. And after such an amazing year, a renaissance of Arab politics, if they don't go out and vote, I think it will be very troubling and very disturbing, and it will be a tragedy, because it will send a message to their politicians. And by the way, if they don't go out and vote, Ra'am, the pragmatists, are the ones who are most likely to be in danger. So it's going to be a test to see where they want to go. Do they want a pragmatist approach? Do they want to be part of Israel as Israeli Arab Palestinian citizens, or do they want, like Ayman Odeh and Ahmed Tibi, preach, that they think that the Palestinian issue is more important than recognizing the Jewish and Zionist government.
Well, look, I haven't followed the Israeli politics as obviously as closely as you, but I understand that the pragmatism of Abbas had its limits during the last year, and there were times, and particularly I think of the vote that caused the dissolution of the government, which was the extension of civil Israeli law to the settlers, that Abbas didn't vote for the government. I think that's right. So I mean, there's obviously, in a way, the pragmatism, if you like it, as you mentioned earlier, is like it's a realization that the Israeli-Palestinian peace process has been pushed off the agenda, and everyone's just sort of kicking that can down the road. Hope, you know, some people hope that they'll never have to deal with it and whatever. But surely this pragmatism on Israelis, Arabs, you know, that surely there's a limit. Once they're sort of in government, will they start saying, listen, you need to start doing more?
I don't see myself as a defender of Mansour Abbas, but I do want to say they are Palestinians, and to ask them to support bills that are occupation bills is just crazy, okay? I don't think that Mansour Abbas needs to convert now to Judaism. I don't expect that, and I also don't expect him to turn Zionist. The reason that the government couldn't pass those bills that had to do with the regulations in Judea and Samaria, it wasn't because of Mansour Abbas. It was because of the opposition, because Netanyahu, because in the 1967, every Zionist opposition supported these bills. Really? Up until this time. Yes, all the Zionist parties besides Meretz never supported this bill. But besides Meretz, whoever was in the opposition, it was never a question. And
so there was never, because there's a deep irony that, you know, that the center and left-wing parties of the government were voting for this bill and the right-wing parties were voting against it. But so in other words, what you're saying is there was never an expectation that Abbas would join the government and have to vote for this bill, because everyone assumed Likud would also vote for it. Because the bill comes up every 6 months or so, doesn't it?
Specifically, yes, but at large, when you talk about all the crises that there were during the year, and there were crises, there was a crisis after Shirin Abu Akleh was killed, and there was a crisis with the tree planting in the Negev, and there was a crisis. We live in the Middle East, and when we live in the middle of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's not over. But the Jewish expectation, I mean, part of being a partner is also respecting what your partner can't give you. So I'm just saying, part of accepting the Arab politicians as partners also needs to understand that there are some things that they cannot vote for and that they cannot support. That being said, it's not as if Abbas and his people are any saints. There were many instances in which they were also problematic and they found it very difficult, and they also didn't know how to compromise. But this is also part of politics. Like the Arab politicians for so many years were not part of the coalition that they didn't know how to make these compromises. So this is things that you need a bit more time to learn to have this political coexistence and to have compromises from both sides.
I hear you. So look, if give or take, obviously the election is still several months away, and only a fool would predict who's going to win or what it will look like. But I can imagine we'll agree that the outcome of the election will be, give or take, it'll be very close, and you know, hopefully one person will be able to scrape over and get over 61 votes. But given that it's just about, so much of it is about Bibi, and as you say, only just over half the country don't like him and half the country do like him. What electoral reforms would you enact if you could, if they passed the pen of power to you? Like, would you increase the threshold to 10%, or like, how could we fix this? And is there any pragmatic chance that that the Israeli politicians can somehow fix the system so we don't have another election in 12 or 18 months time and another one 12 or 18 months time after that?
And No, I don't think that the Israeli politicians will fix the system. Because the only way to fix the current, and I'm saying this sadly, the only way to fix the current situation will probably be by Netanyahu leaving eventually. Maybe if we would have a longer time without elections, then things could calm down. But the impact of having an election every year is that there's no time to reconcile. Even with Netanyahu, there's no time to reconcile. So that's the main. I think that's the main problem. And personally, I think that, for instance, the fact that there was a prime minister from a party with 6 seats is a stretch of democracy, which should never be allowed again. But the only way to solve that is to have the 2 big parties once form a unity government together, meaning the Likud and Yesh Atid. Lapid will never sit with Netanyahu. That will never happen under Netanyahu. So unfortunately, I don't see any way to fix the system in the upcoming future. I do hope that next time there's a stable government by any side, led by anyone, because I think that even the year that this government was established, that the Bennett-Lapid government was established and passed the budget, was better than another year of elections. And if the political system is sick and the election is like these seizures, then you got to postpone the seizures as much as you can.
Yeah, I hear. Look, there's been a question here for a while from Bob asking about the new Olim, particularly the Russians and the Ukrainians that are coming in. How will they vote? And also the Ethiopian Jews keep on coming in. I mean, where do their votes lie?
So the Ethiopian vote is basically divided between, mostly divided between the Likud and Blue and White, because both of them have Ethiopian representatives on their list. And it's a very traditional vote there. Now there's a younger generation who I don't know, they're totally Israelis. I don't think there's necessarily, which is also true about the Russian vote. Second generation or Russians in Israel, or what we call generation 0.5, people who came on Aliyah when they were very, very young, then their distribution has nothing to do with necessarily with their identity. About the new Olim, the ones that came from Ukraine and from Russia, I'm not sure how many of them stayed here and will actually be here to vote. But let's say that there are I think there's about 50,000 altogether who came. So we did see 2 parties focusing on them. One, traditionally, Israel Beitenu, we're very keen on working with them, and we're there, and we're welcoming them at the airports, and we're also continued contact with them in their housing projects wherever the Olim were put. And Blue and White, Pnina Tamano-Shata, the Ethiopian minister, the first Ethiopian minister, who is currently the immigration and observation minister. So she also, Blue and White also put in effort in the Olim. I would predict that most of them will vote for Lieberman because of the language barrier. It's just the first people they met were representatives of Israel Beitenu who spoke Russian with them, which is,
Well, see, that's the other thing, because I was having a chat, it would have been a year ago or so, a friend of mine who was born in Israel to parents who had immigrated from the former Soviet Union, and she speaks Russian fluently. She said that no major party has ever had a Russian speaker in, say, the top 5 of their list, except obviously for Israel Beitenu. Does that ring true to you?
No, Likud had Yuli Edelstein #1 in the last primary.
Okay, so, cool. Well then, that's wrong.
And Zev Elkin when he was, Zev Elkin is #2 in Gideon Saar's list. He's
okay,
also,
and they're Russian speakers. Okay, good. All right, thank you. Then I will having not Googled that fact that she told me a year ago, I will now go back to her and I'll say I've heard from the best source.
No worries.
Look, Tal, can I
just
thank
to say,
you so much.
out of all our Israel's over 70 years of absorbing Aliyah, not very successfully. I think that the Russian immigration of the 90s is probably the most well absorbed in Israel, and especially in politics. I mean, they're very influential in politics. There are about maybe 10 or 11 Russian speaker MKs in the Knesset. That's quite a lot. So
okay, yeah, good. It's good to know. I guess sheer numbers and I guess levels of education when they came in had something to do with that. Tal, thank you so much for your time this evening. It has been revelatory. I feel I have a slightly stronger grasp on the Israeli system leading towards November, and we will be following your messages closely. Now, you write for a Hebrew language website. Do you write things in English that our audience might want to follow?
Not yet, but I might have news for that in the next 2 weeks. So if I do, I will let you know.
Love it, and we will let our followers know as well as soon as we see any news that come out. So thanks once again, everyone. Next month is August, and that is the ZFA's biennial educators conference. Now, it didn't actually happen 2 years ago because of COVID, but we are really looking forward to having our educators conference in Melbourne in person next month. And our ZFA conversation next month will be both education themed and will involve one or two speakers from that conference, one or two of our international guests. So we will send you more information about that in the coming weeks. Until then, everyone have a wonderful month. Stay warm if you're here in Australia. Stay cool if you're in Israel. And thank you once again. Good night.